Retired Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Dan Hampton. Colonel, great to have you back on the show. Appreciate your being here.
Thanks, Governor. It's good to be here.
Colonel, at least 4 different military generals and experts have said that we really can't go in and destroy ISIS with only air power. There has to be some type of combat action on the ground. Agree, disagree?
I agree, but what I would caveat that with is they don't have to be American boots on the ground. You're exactly right. You cannot win a war from the air. We tried that in the Gulf Wars. We tried that in that little fracas 50 years ago called the Vietnam War. It doesn't work. Air power used in conjunction with boots on the ground will work, but going back to what you said a few minutes earlier, they've got to get the semantics right and the objective right and the goals right before they start to get serious about that. Otherwise, there's going to be a lot of shiny coffins coming back through Dover Air Force Base.
And Colonel, one of the things I think a lot of us are concerned about is that there's this muddled message as to whether or not this is going to be a warlike action, or what else is there? When you start sending people into harm's way, loaded with weapons, and they're shooting to kill people, what can you call it other than a war? And from your perspective as a warrior, does it even matter?
It doesn't matter to me when I'm there, and I had no ethical or moral ambiguities in any fight that I was ever in. But it does matter from the larger political standpoint and support and what happens afterwards. We saw what happened in Iraq because there was no plan after the war, because nobody would really admit that from 2003 to 2011 that there was still a war going on. And I would say that if the Kerry, Obama, Biden show can't decide what to call this, then we shouldn't commit anybody until they can.
Colonel, I get the impression that nobody from the Pentagon is really being listened to in the White House or in the State Department. Here's my question. You're retired, so you can get away with answering this. You couldn't if you were on active duty. Is there not a point at which some senior military people are going to have to publicly resign and say, I'm not going to disobey an order from the Commander-in-Chief, but I'm not going to follow orders that don't make sense? Are we going to see that happen?
Boy, I sure hope so. I was never a general officer, thankfully. I didn't want to deal with that. And I've got to believe that some of them up there would rather fall on their sword, if you will, than be a part of something that isn't going to make sense from the beginning. You were talking about the fog of war. Well, we're used to that on a battlefield, but what you don't want is fog being generated from your own side, and that's what's coming out of the White House, is just pure fog.
I want to talk about Iran because you and I may have a different opinion on this, but the Iranians have maybe offered some level of assistance. How in the world can we trust the Iranians, their government, not their people, but their government? How can we trust them?
Well, they might say the same thing about us, and what I would say, at this point in history, I think it's time to be pragmatic about who our allies are over there, and that also includes Syria, if you want to talk about that. But the Iranians never really had much of an issue with us until the 70s and the Shah and Mossadegh and some of the other things that happened. And they know that they've got a problem in their own country now with the majority of their population being too young to remember any of that. They know they've got an economic problem that would choke a horse. We've got the answers to some of that. I'm not saying unconditionally give in to them or trust them, because you don't really ever trust anybody. But I'm saying that there's some room there, and they could really be a big help. For instance, their economy's in a bad way. All right, we can go a long way to resolving some of that under the condition of, say, they're not funding terrorism anymore. And in one sweep here, we could cut the knees off of Hezbollah and half a dozen other terror groups that I could think of that the Iranians fund. I think they would do that in return for economic assistance and some international recognition and a chance to be involved in this. Because face it, they're in the region. They're like Syria. Okay, ISIS is much closer to home for them than it is for us.
Well, considering how much funding that they've put toward Hamas and Hezbollah and the statements of their leaders that they want to wipe Israel from the face of the map, I hope that there could be something, but I'll be very, very reluctant unless they repudiate some of those comments about Israel and they absolutely eliminate their checkbook. But I do understand where you're coming from. Colonel, great to have you back. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thanks, always a pleasure.